blood on pristine white linoleum is a terrifying sight, but the man leaving the trail was the true nightmare. When Dominic Corelli, the ruthless head of the Chicago syndicates, kicked through the double doors of St. Jude's emergency room carrying his dying brother, the entire hospital froze. Doctors backed away. Security guards lowered their radios, paralyzed by the sight of the city's most dangerous man holding a loaded Glock in one hand and a bleeding body in the other. He demanded a miracle at gunpoint. But in a room full of terrified professionals, one exhausted triage nurse stepped directly into his line of fire. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply looked the Mafia boss dead in the eye and said the one thing that stopped his raging heart cold. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Medical Center buzzed with a sterile, monotonous hum that usually signaled a quiet Tuesday night. Genevieve Lawson, known to the ER staff simply as Evie, rubbed her temples, trying to ward off the impending migraine. At 28, she had spent 5 years working the graveyard shift in one of Chicago's most demanding trauma wards. She was used to gunshot wounds, overdoses, and the desperate cries of the grieving. But nothing could have prepared the staff for the hurricane that hit the triage bays at exactly 2:14 a.m. It started with the sound of shattered glass. The heavy, reinforced sliding doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open. They were violently wrenched apart, shattering the safety glass into 1,000 glittering pieces across the floor. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Evie looked up from her charting station just in time to see 4 men storm into the trauma center. They were dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits that were now ruined, saturated with a heavy metallic stench. At the center of the chaotic formation was Dominic Corelli. Everyone in the city knew Dominic. Even those who didn't follow the underworld whispers recognized the sharp, predatory lines of his jaw, the slicked-back raven hair, and the terrifyingly calm, dead-eyed stare that had earned him the moniker Il Mietitore, the Reaper. But tonight, Dominic wasn't calm. He was a wild, cornered beast. In his arms he carried a younger man, Leo Corelli, Dominic's little brother. Leo's white dress shirt was completely soaked in a terrifying crimson, his head lolling backward, eyes rolled back into his skull. "I need a doctor," Dominic roared, his voice bouncing off the tiled walls with the force of a physical blow. "I need a fucking surgeon right now." Dr. Samuel Harrison, the attending physician, froze in the hallway. He was a veteran doctor, but the sight of Dominic Corelli waving a matte black Glock 19 was enough to root his boots to the linoleum. The nurses scattered behind the desks. A young orderly dropped a tray of instruments, the clatter echoing like gunshots, causing 2 of Dominic's enforcers to draw their own weapons, sweeping the room. "Who is in charge?" Dominic bellowed, pointing the barrel of his gun directly at Dr. Harrison's chest. "You? Fix him. If his heart stops, I'm putting a bullet in yours." Panic is a contagious disease, and it was rapidly infecting the ER. Dr. Harrison stammered, raising his hands, his eyes darting between the gun and the bleeding boy. Sir, please, you need to lower the weapon. We can't work like this." "I said fix him." Dominic stepped forward, the raw, unfiltered agony of a brother watching his only family die, turning his rage into pure, unfiltered violence. The safety of the Glock clicked off. The sound was deafening in the silence. Evie watched from the nurse's station, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She looked at Dr. Harrison, who was practically hyperventilating, then down at Leo, whose skin was taking on a waxy, greyish pallor. Hypovolemic shock, her brain calculated automatically. He has minutes, maybe less. She didn't think. If she had thought about it, she would have cowered like the rest of them. Instead, Evie shoved her chair back, grabbed a pair of sterile trauma shears and a massive stack of gauze, and walked out from behind the safety of the reinforced desk. "Hey!" One of the enforcers, a massive wall of a man named Gideon, barked, aiming his weapon at her. "Stay back!" Evie ignored him. She walked directly toward Dominic. The Mafia boss whipped his gun toward her, the barrel stopping inches from her forehead. His eyes were wild, dilated, swimming with grief and murderous intent. "Take one more step and I'll blow your head off," Dominic snarled, the threat rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. Evie stopped. She didn't look at the gun. She looked directly into Dominic's furious, dark eyes. "Your gun won't stop him from bleeding out," Evie said, her voice eerily calm, cutting through the hysteria like a scalpel. "But my hands will. Now you can either shoot me and watch your brother die on this dirty floor, or you can put the damn gun away and help me lift him onto bed 3. Make your choice, Mr. Corelli. You have about 60 seconds before he bleeds out completely." The entire room held its breath. Gideon tensed, waiting for the order to fire. Dr. Harrison squeezed his eyes shut. Dominic stared at the woman in the pale blue scrubs. She wasn't shaking. Her eyes, a sharp, piercing hazel, held absolutely no fear. For a fraction of a second, the Mafia boss was entirely disarmed, not by force, but by sheer, absolute defiance. The rage in him hit a brick wall. Dominic lowered the weapon. "Bed 3, Dominic commanded, his voice dropping an octave, the wildness replaced by a cold, sharp focus. "Let's move!" Evie barked, suddenly commanding the room. "Harrison, snap out of it! I need 2 large-bore IVs. Push O-negative uncross-matched blood, now. Get the crash cart." The next 45 minutes were a blur of organized chaos, bathed in the blinding light of the overhead surgical lamps. Trauma Bay 1 became a battlefield, and Evie was the general. Dominic refused to leave the room. He stood in the corner, a dark, looming shadow, his tailored suit completely ruined, hands coated in his brother's blood. His enforcers stood guard outside the glass doors, physically blocking hospital security and the 2 terrified beat cops who had responded to the disturbance call. "Pressure is tanking, 70/40, Evie called out, her hands covered in blood as she packed the massive exit wound in Leo's right shoulder. The bullet had torn through the subclavian artery. It was a messy, brutal hit. "He's coding!" Dr. Harrison yelled, panic creeping back into his voice as the monitor began to emit a rapid, high-pitched alarm. "VFib! Charge the paddles to 200! Clear!" Leo's body arched off the table. The flatline persisted. In the corner, Dominic let out a low, guttural sound, like a wounded animal. He took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon tucked into his waistband. "Stay back!" Evie snapped, not even turning around. "Charge to 300. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine. Clear!" Thump. The body dropped back down. Evie stared at the monitor. "Come on," she prayed silently. "Come on, kid." A slow, rhythmic beep broke the silence. The green line on the monitor spiked. "We have a pulse," Dr. Harrison gasped, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "It's weak, but it's there. We need to get him up to the OR right now to repair the artery." "Do it," Dominic said, stepping out of the shadows. His voice was ragged. He looked at Dr. Harrison. "If he dies on that table, Doctor, you better keep cutting until you find a place to hide." As the surgical team frantically wheeled Leo's stretcher out of the bay, Evie stayed behind to clean up the immediate biohazard. The adrenaline that had sustained her was beginning to crash, leaving her hands trembling slightly. She walked over to the sink, aggressively scrubbing the blood from her skin, watching the pink water swirl down the drain. "You're shaking." The deep, gravelly voice came from right behind her. Evie stiffened, turning off the tap. She turned around to find Dominic Corelli standing just a few feet away. Without the frantic energy of saving his brother, his presence was even more overwhelming. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a terrifying stillness about him. "Adrenaline," Evie said flatly, reaching for a paper towel. "It happens when someone points a loaded gun at my face." Dominic's jaw ticked. He pulled a pristine, white linen handkerchief from his pocket and slowly began to wipe the blood from his own hands. Most people would have run. "Most people aren't triage nurses," Evie replied, throwing the paper towel away. "We don't run from blood." "You knew who I was?" It wasn't a question. "Dominic Corelli, head of the Corelli Syndicate. You control the ports, the unions, and half the politicians in the city," Evie recited, her tone incredibly bored, as if she were reading a grocery list. "And right now, you're a mess, standing in my trauma bay, violating about 50 health and safety protocols." Dominic stepped closer. The air between them seemed to crackle, thick with an unspoken tension. He was used to people cowering, agreeing, or running. This woman was standing toe-to-toe with him, completely unimpressed by the monster lurking beneath his skin. "What's your name, nurse?" he asked softly. "Genevieve Lawson." "Well, Genevieve Lawson, you saved my brother's life tonight," Dominic said, his dark eyes tracing the lines of her face, memorizing her features. "I owe you a debt. The Corelli family does not forget a debt." "I don't want your debt," Evie said immediately, her voice hardening. "I was doing my job. You don't owe me anything. Just take your brother, pay the hospital bill, and don't ever bring your wars into my ER again." A dark, dangerous smile played on Dominic's lips. "I'm afraid it doesn't work like that. I decide when a debt is paid." Before Evie could retort, the doors swung open and Gideon stepped in, his face grim. "Boss, we have a problem." Dominic didn't break eye contact with Evie. "What is it, Gideon?" "The scouts outside," Gideon said, lowering his voice, though Evie could still hear. "Silas Moretti's men just pulled up to the perimeter. They know Leo is here. They're here to finish the job." Dominic's expression instantly turned to stone. The brief moment of humanity he had shown evaporated, replaced by the ruthless mob boss. He looked back at Evie. "Lock down the floor," Dominic ordered her. "No one gets in or out." "You can't just take over a hospital," Evie argued, stepping forward. "There are sick people here. And there are going to be a lot of dead ones if you don't do exactly what I say," Dominic countered, pulling a fresh magazine from his jacket and sliding it into his Glock with a sharp click. "Silas Moretti doesn't care about collateral damage. Now lock the doors." The hospital descended into a suffocating, terrifying lockdown. Code Silver, an active shooter alert, flashed across the hospital pages, but Dominic's men had already seized the security room. They weren't letting the police handle this. This was syndicate business. Evie barricaded herself and 3 other nurses in the medication dispensary room, watching the security feeds on the internal monitors. She could see Dominic's men strategically positioned at the elevators and stairwells. Down in the main lobby, she saw the heavily armed men belonging to the Moretti family, a brutal, unhinged rival gang that had been trying to usurp the Corellis for a decade. The silence in the hospital was heavier than noise. Every minute dragged like an hour. "Evie, what are we going to do?" whispered Claire, a younger nurse, tears streaming down her face. "They're going to kill us all." "No, they're not," Evie said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. She looked at the monitor displaying the 4th floor, the surgical wing where Leo was currently under the knife. Dominic was pacing the hallway outside the OR, a lone wolf guarding his den. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The emergency backup generators hummed to life, casting the hospital in a dim, eerie red glow. The Moretti men had cut the main power. Evie knew the hospital blueprints better than anyone. She knew there was an old, decommissioned service elevator that connected the basement morgue directly to the surgical wing, a path the mobsters wouldn't know about, but one that Silas Moretti's men could easily find if they forced a janitor to talk. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me," Evie told the nurses, grabbing a heavy metal flashlight and a bundle of zip ties from the supply closet. "Are you crazy?" Claire hissed. "You can't go out there." "If they get to the 4th floor, they'll shoot right through the OR doors," Evie said grimly. "My patient is in there." Evie slipped out into the red-lit hallway, keeping low. She moved like a ghost, bypassing the main corridors and taking the laundry chutes and maintenance hallways. She reached the 3rd-floor landing just in time to hear heavy footsteps echoing in the stairwell above the morgue. She crept to the edge of the corridor and peered around the corner. 3 men in leather jackets, carrying suppressed submachine guns, were prying open the doors to the old service elevator. Evie's heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She had lived in the shadows of violence before. She knew the smell of it. Instead of hiding, Evie reached over to a fire alarm pull station on the wall. She didn't pull it. That would alert them to her position. Instead, she grabbed a heavy, rolling IV pole, waited until the men stepped into the open elevator shaft to climb the interior ladder, and shoved the pole violently down the hallway. It crashed loudly against a metal utility cart. The 3 men whipped around, raising their weapons at the noise, stepping away from the elevator shaft. At that exact moment, a shadow dropped from the ceiling access panel above them. Dominic. He didn't use a gun. He moved with terrifying, lethal silence, a combat knife glinting in the red light. In less than 5 seconds, 2 of the men were bleeding out on the floor, their vocal cords severed before they could scream. The 3rd man managed to raise his gun, but Dominic violently twisted his arm, breaking it with a sickening snap, before slamming the man's head into the concrete wall. The hallway went dead silent again, save for the heavy breathing of the Mafia boss. Dominic stood up, wiping the blade on the jacket of one of the unconscious men. He looked down the hallway, directly into the shadows where Evie was hiding. "You can come out, Genevieve," he called out softly. Evie stepped into the dim light, clutching her flashlight. She looked at the bodies, then at Dominic. She didn't flinch, didn't scream. Dominic's eyes narrowed. He walked slowly toward her, stopping just inches away. The metallic smell of blood was overwhelming again. "You didn't stay in the dispensary," he noted, his voice a low rumble. "You came up here to intercept them. Why?" "They were going for the service elevator. It leads directly to the OR. Dr. Harrison is operating on your brother," Evie said, keeping her chin up. "I protect my patients." Dominic studied her. It was a deep, invasive look, as if he were trying to peel back the layers of her skin to see the machinery underneath. "You didn't flinch when I killed them," Dominic stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a revelation. A normal woman would be screaming. A normal woman would be throwing up. But you looked at the entry wounds. You assessed the damage. Evie swallowed hard, but held his gaze. "I'm a trauma nurse." "Don't lie to me," Dominic whispered, leaning in closer. His breath brushed against her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I know the look of someone who has seen the devil before." "Who are you really, Evie?" Evie stepped back, putting distance between them. She looked down at the men on the floor. "The bullet you pulled out of your brother down in the ER. It was a 9mm hollow point, but it was modified, cross-cut at the tip to fragment on impact." Dominic froze. The casual, dangerous swagger vanished, replaced by genuine shock. "How the hell do you know that?" Evie looked up at him, her hazel eyes completely hollowed out by an old, deep grief. Because 10 years ago, a stray bullet from a syndicate shootout hit my 6-year-old brother in the chest while we were walking home from school. It was the exact same modified hollow point. I know because I was the one holding him while he bled to death on the sidewalk. Dominic stared at her, utterly speechless for the first time in his life. "I don't fear you, Mr. Corelli," Evie said, her voice dropping to a harsh, bitter whisper. "Because you are exactly the kind of monster that already took everything I had to lose. Now get your men out of my hospital." The silence that followed Evie's devastating confession was heavier than the humid, blood-scented air of the third-floor corridor. Dominic Corelli, the man who held Chicago's underworld in a vice grip, looked at the exhausted triage nurse as if she had just materialized from thin air. The absolute fearlessness in her hazel eyes wasn't born of ignorance. It was forged in the exact same fires of hell that Dominic walked through every single day. Before Dominic could formulate a response to the revelation about her brother, the heavy steel doors at the end of the hallway burst open. Gideon, Dominic's massive right-hand man, stormed through, his assault rifle raised, closely followed by 2 more syndicate enforcers. "Boss!" Gideon barked, taking in the scene, the 3 dead Moretti hitmen on the floor, and the tense, suffocating proximity between Dominic and the nurse. "We pushed them back. Sirens are closing in. CPD's SWAT unit is 3 minutes out. We need to move Leo now." Dominic didn't immediately turn away from Evie. His dark eyes remained locked on hers, absorbing the tremor in her jaw that she fought so desperately to hide. He finally stepped back, the cold, calculating mask of Il Mietitore sliding flawlessly back into place. "Is my brother out of surgery?" Dominic demanded, his voice echoing sharply against the concrete. "Yes." "The doc stabilized the artery," Gideon confirmed, stepping over a pooling puddle of blood. "We have a secure med-evac ambulance waiting at the loading dock. But Moretti's guys, boss, they saw her. When she shoved that IV pole, the scouts down in the lobby caught it on the internal security feed before we cut the hard lines." Silas knows a nurse intervened. Evie's stomach plummeted. The adrenaline that had kept her standing was rapidly turning to ice in her veins. She knew exactly what that meant. In the ruthless chess game of syndicate warfare, there were no civilian bystanders. You were either an asset or a liability. Silas Moretti, known for his unhinged cruelty, would see her as a target. "Get Leo in the ambulance," Dominic ordered, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. He turned his imposing frame fully toward Evie. "You're coming with us." "Excuse me," Evie snapped, instinctively stepping back. "I am not going anywhere with you. My shift isn't even over. I have patients." "Your shift ended the second you stepped between my family and Silas Moretti's guns," Dominic interrupted, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. He grabbed her upper arm, not hard enough to bruise, but with enough immovable force to let her know she had no choice. "If you stay in this hospital, Genevieve, you will be dead before sunrise. Moretti will send men to your apartment. He will find your family, and he will make an example out of you." "I don't have any family left," Evie yelled, the raw, unhealed grief ripping through her composure. "Your world already made sure of that." Dominic's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking violently beneath his skin. For a fraction of a second, genuine regret flashed in his pitch-black eyes. "Then I will not let it take you too. Gideon, secure the corridor. We leave in 60 seconds. Evie fought him, planting her feet on the linoleum, but dragging Dominic Corelli was like trying to move a freight train. He practically carried her down the hidden staff stairwell, bypassing the chaos of the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating the main entrance. They emerged into the freezing, biting wind of the Chicago night. A heavily armored, matte black Mercedes Sprinter van sat idling in the alleyway, surrounded by 4 black SUVs. Evie was shoved into the back of the plush, dimly lit Sprinter, landing hard against the leather seats. Dominic climbed in right behind her, slamming the heavy door shut and sealing them in the quiet interior. The convoy tore out of the alley, diving immediately into the subterranean labyrinth of Lower Wacker Drive. The concrete pillars and orange sodium lights flashed by in a dizzying blur, hiding them from the CPD helicopters circling above St. Jude's. Evie curled into the corner of the seat, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her pale blue scrubs were stiff with dried blood. Leo's blood. She stared out the tinted window, her mind racing. She had spent 10 years running from the violence that took her little brother, dedicating her life to saving people from it, only to be dragged right into the epicenter of the city's deadliest crime family. Dominic sat opposite her, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid from a crystal decanter into a lowball glass. He held it out to her. "Drink," he commanded softly. "It helps with the shock." "I'm not in shock," Evie lied, refusing to take the glass. "I'm a hostage." Dominic downed the liquor himself, the ice clinking against the glass. "You are under my protection. There is a very distinct difference." "Where are you taking me?" "To a place where Moretti's ghosts can't reach you." 20 minutes later, the convoy pulled into a heavily guarded underground parking garage beneath a towering, glass-fronted high-rise on North Astor Street, the most exclusive and secure stretch of real estate in Chicago's Gold Coast. Evie was escorted onto a private, biometric elevator that shot silently up to the penthouse. When the doors parted, she stepped into a world of breathtaking, clinical luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sprawling, panoramic view of the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, and intimidating. But what caught Evie's eye were the men. Heavily armed guards were stationed at every entrance, their suits sharp, their eyes sharp enough to cut glass. "Show Miss Lawson to the East Wing guest suite," Dominic told an older, impeccably dressed man named Matteo, who appeared to manage the penthouse. Dominic then turned to Evie, his expression unreadable. "Matteo will get you whatever you need. Lock the door. Try to sleep. Tomorrow, we figure out how to clean up this mess." "Dominic," Evie called out as he turned to leave. He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. It was the first time she had used his first name. "Why do you care? You have your brother back. Why not just leave me to Moretti?" Dominic stepped closer, his imposing shadow falling over her. He reached out, his knuckles lightly brushing against a streak of dried blood on her cheek. The touch was startlingly gentle, a total contradiction to the violence in his hands. "Because 10 years ago, my world took something precious from you," Dominic murmured, his voice a dark, velvet rasp. "I don't intend to let it take anything else. You're mine to protect now, Genevieve. And the Reaper does not lose what belongs to him." The East Wing guest suite was the size of Evie's entire apartment, boasting a massive king-sized bed, a marble bathroom, and a closet pre-stocked with high-end designer clothes with the tag still attached. It was a gilded cage. Evie spent 30 minutes standing under the scalding hot spray of the rain shower, aggressively scrubbing Leo Corelli's blood from under her fingernails. When she finally stepped out, she dressed in a pair of soft cashmere sweatpants and a simple white t-shirt she found in the closet. She felt numb, adrift in a reality she couldn't control. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the dark, rolling waves of the lake, waiting. At exactly 4 a.m., there was a soft knock at the door. It didn't wait for an answer. Dominic walked in. He had changed out of his ruined suit. He wore a pair of dark slacks and a black, unbuttoned dress shirt that revealed the sprawling, intricate ink of a dark angel tattoo across his chest. He looked exhausted, the heavy burdens of his empire carving deep lines around his eyes. He carried a thick manila folder in his hands. "How is Leo?" Evie asked, her clinical instincts momentarily overriding her resentment. "Alive. Breathing on his own. Our private physicians have him stabilized in the medical bay downstairs," Dominic said, walking over and dropping the heavy folder onto the glass coffee table at the foot of the bed. "Thanks to you." Evie glanced at the folder. "What is that?" Dominic sat down heavily on the edge of a velvet armchair, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at Evie, his dark eyes stripped of their usual arrogance, leaving something raw and terrifyingly vulnerable in its wake. "When you told me about the bullet, the modified 9mm hollow point," Dominic began, his voice tight. "I had Matteo dig into the syndicate archives. I needed to know whose gun took your brother." Evie's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to hammer violently against her ribs. "Why? What difference does it make now? He's gone." "It makes a difference because I needed to know if it was my family who pulled the trigger," Dominic confessed, the weight of the words seemingly suffocating him. "My father was a brutal man, Genevieve. He fought a war in the streets 10 years ago. I needed to know if the blood of your 6-year-old brother was on my family's hands. Because if it was, I don't think I could look at you." Evie stared at him, stunned by the absolute sincerity in the Mafia boss's confession. The man who ordered executions without blinking was terrified of her judgment. "And?" Evie whispered, her voice trembling. "Was it?" Dominic shook his head slowly. He reached forward and flipped open the manila folder. Inside were old, faded police reports, ballistics photos, and syndicate intelligence files. "The crosscut modification on a 9mm hollow point is a highly specific signature," Dominic explained, pointing to a grainy photograph of a shattered bullet casing. "It's designed to maximize internal tissue damage, to make sure the target bleeds out before an ambulance can arrive. My family uses standard ammunition. The only man in Chicago who mandated that specific modification a decade ago was Silas Moretti." Evie felt the blood drain entirely from her face. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. 10 years ago, Silas was a lieutenant, trying to make a name for himself, Dominic continued, his voice hardening into cold steel. "He ordered a drive-by hit on one of my father's bookies in the South Side. It was sloppy. They fired blindly into a crowd. We were just walking home from getting ice cream," Evie whispered, the memory rushing back with horrifying clarity. The deafening pop, 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 the sudden weight of little Tommy's hand slipping from hers, the bright red spreading across his tiny superhero t-shirt. He was just a baby. Dominic stood up, walking over to the bed. He knelt down in front of her, forcing her to look at him. His large, scarred hands gently enveloped her trembling ones. "Silas Moretti took your brother, Genevieve," Dominic vowed, the promise dripping with lethal intent. "And tonight, he tried to take mine. I swear to you, on my life, I am going to tear his empire down to the studs. I will make him bleed for every second of pain he caused you." For the first time in a decade, Evie didn't feel the need to be strong. The wall she had built around her heart cracked, and a single, hot tear slipped down her cheek. Dominic reached up, catching the tear with his thumb. The intimacy of the gesture was breathtaking, a quiet storm of electricity passing between them. But the fragile, emotionally charged moment was shattered instantly. The heavy oak door to the guest suite didn't just open, it was kicked violently off its hinges, splintering the wood into 100 pieces. Dominic moved with the speed of a striking viper, He lunged, pushing Evie flat onto the mattress and throwing his massive body over hers, drawing the Glock from his waistband in one fluid motion. A suppressed bullet hissed through the air, shattering the glass lamp on the nightstand, right where Evie's head had been a second prior. Dominic fired twice into the doorway, rolling off the bed and pulling Evie down to the floor behind the solid oak frame of the bedstead. "Stay down!" he roared. Evie covered her ears, her heart exploding in her chest. Dominic peered around the edge of the bed, his gun aimed squarely at the doorway. But he didn't fire again. Instead, his entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated betrayal. Stepping through the ruined doorway, a suppressed tactical pistol gripped firmly in his hand, wasn't one of Silas Moretti's street thugs. It was Matteo, the trusted penthouse manager. "Put the gun down, Dominic," Matteo said, his voice eerily calm, devoid of the grandfatherly warmth he had displayed just an hour ago. "It's over." "Matteo!" Dominic growled, a terrifying low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "You sold us out to Moretti. Moretti offered me the ports. You offered me a pension," Matteo sneered, raising the weapon and aiming it directly at the spot where Evie was hiding behind Dominic. "Silas sends his regards, and he wants the nurse." Dominic's grip on his Glock tightened, his dark eyes blazing with a demonic fury. "If you want her, Matteo, you have to go through the Reaper first." The air in the luxurious East Wing guest suite grew impossibly thin, suffocated by the heavy stench of cordite and impending death. Matteo, a man who had served the Corelli family for over 3 decades, stood in the splintered doorway with a suppressed tactical pistol leveled directly at Dominic. The older man's face, usually arranged in a mask of polite, grandfatherly deference, was now twisted into a sneer of cold, calculating greed. "Put the gun down, Dominic," Matteo repeated, his voice perfectly steady. "I disabled the biometric locks on the private elevator. Silas has 12 heavily armed men coming up right now. They'll be on this floor in exactly 2 minutes. You are outmanned, outgunned, and out of time." Dominic did not lower his Glock. He remained crouched in front of Evie, his broad shoulders acting as an impenetrable human shield. His dark eyes, however, burned with a terrifying, apocalyptic fury. "You traded 30 years of loyalty for a piece of the docks, Matteo. You think Silas Moretti is going to let you live once you hand me over? He cleans house. He always cleans house." "Silas and I have an understanding," Matteo replied, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room. "The Corelli era is over, boss. You got soft. You started caring about collateral damage. Silas understands that in this city, blood is just the currency of doing business. Now, kick the weapon away. I only need the nurse alive to flush you out, but if you fight me, I'll put a bullet in her spine just to watch you suffer before Silas gets up here." Behind Dominic, Ivy pressed her back against the solid oak frame of the bed. Her heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs, but her mind, honed by years of making split-second decisions in a chaotic trauma ward, was eerily lucid. She looked at the floor. Just inches from her hand lay the heavy, solid bronze base of the shattered nightstand lamp. Dominic slightly shifted his weight, his muscles coiled like a striking viper. He was calculating the distance, the trajectory of Matteo's gun, the fraction of a second he would need to close the gap. "Don't do it, kid," Matteo warned, his finger whitening on the trigger. "You're fast, but you aren't faster than a 9mm at point-blank range." Evie didn't wait for Dominic to make a move. She knew he would sacrifice himself to shield her, and she refused to let another person die for her tonight. Her fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy bronze lamp base. With a sudden, violent burst of energy, Evie lunged sideways from behind Dominic's massive frame, hurling the heavy bronze weight directly at Matteo with everything she had. "Hey!" Evie screamed. The heavy metal object flew through the air, striking Matteo squarely in the kneecap with a sickening crack. Matteo let out a sharp cry of agony, his leg buckling instantly. His finger convulsed on the trigger. The suppressed pistol hissed, spitting a bullet that tore through the fabric of Dominic's black dress shirt, grazing the ribs on his left side before burying itself in the wall behind them. That microsecond of distraction was all the Reaper needed. Dominic crossed the room in a terrifying blur of motion. Before Matteo could correct his aim, Dominic's left hand shot out, grabbing the slide of the pistol and violently wrenching it upward, breaking Matteo's wrist in a single, brutal motion. With his right hand, Dominic drove the butt of his Glock squarely into Matteo's jaw. The sound of shattering bone echoed through the suite. Matteo collapsed to the floor, a crumpled, bloody mess, groaning in agony as his weapon clattered across the hardwood. Dominic stood over him, chest heaving, his eyes entirely black. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at the space between the traitor's eyes. "Wait!" Evie gasped, scrambling to her feet. "Dominic, the elevator! He said you have 2 minutes!" Dominic froze. The ruthless, bloodthirsty instinct of the syndicate boss warred with the cold, tactical logic of survival. He lowered the gun, though his gaze remained lethal. "Gideon!" Dominic roared into the hidden lapel microphone of his earpiece. "Code Red! Breach on the penthouse floor! Matteo is compromised. Moretti hit squad coming up the private shaft. Lock down the panic room." "Copy that, boss." Gideon's rough voice crackled back instantly through the earpiece, loud enough for Evie to hear the frantic cocking of assault rifles in the background. "Engaging targets now." Almost immediately, the muffled, heavy thud of automatic gunfire erupted from the grand foyer of the penthouse. The war had arrived at their doorstep. "Let's move," Dominic ordered, grabbing Evie by the hand. His grip was tight, his large hand completely enveloping hers. They ran. They sprinted out of the ruined guest suite and down the long, shadowed corridor of the East Wing. The penthouse was a sprawling labyrinth of modern art and glass walls, now illuminated by the frantic, flashing strobe of the security alarm's red emergency lights. The sound of the firefight in the lobby was deafening, glass shattering, men shouting, the heavy boom of a shotgun echoing over the rattle of submachine guns. Evie kept her head down, her bare feet slipping slightly on the polished marble floors. She glanced at Dominic and gasped. A dark, wet stain was rapidly spreading across the left side of his black shirt. "You're hit!" she yelled over the noise. "It's a graze," Dominic grunted, not breaking his stride. "Keep moving." They reached a set of heavy, reinforced steel double doors at the end of the corridor. Dominic pressed his blood-smeared thumb to a biometric scanner hidden behind a piece of abstract art. The heavy bolts clacked backward, and the doors hissed open. Dominic shoved Evie inside, stepping in right behind her and slamming his fist onto the emergency lockdown button. The massive steel doors slid shut with a definitive, airtight thud, cutting off the chaotic sounds of the firefight outside almost entirely. They were in the penthouse's safe room, which doubled as a fully equipped, state-of-the-art medical bay. The safe room was blindingly white, a stark contrast to the blood and darkness they had just escaped. In the center of the room, lying on a high-tech hospital bed hooked up to a ventilator and an array of monitors, was Leo Corelli. A private, terrified-looking syndicate doctor was hovering over him, checking the IV lines. Dominic leaned heavily against the reinforced steel door, sliding down slightly until he was sitting on the floor. His breathing was shallow, his face pale, slick with a cold sweat. He dropped his gun to the floor, finally pressing his hand hard against his bleeding side. Evie didn't hesitate. The absolute terror of the last 10 minutes evaporated, entirely replaced by the cold, clinical focus of her profession. She marched over to the stainless steel medical supply cabinets, yanking them open. "Doctor!" Evie barked at the man attending to Leo, her voice sharp and commanding. "Is the boy stable?" Yes," the doctor stammered. "Vitals are holding. The arterial repair is intact." "Good. Watch his pressure. Give me a suture kit, lidocaine, a staple gun, and 4 packs of sterile gauze. Now." Evie dropped to her knees on the floor beside Dominic. She didn't ask for permission. She simply grabbed the hem of his ruined, expensive dress shirt and ripped it open, popping the remaining buttons to expose his chest and abdomen. "You're very demanding, Nurse Lawson," Dominic murmured, his voice a raspy whisper. A faint ghost of a smirk played on his pale lips, completely at odds with the severity of the situation. "Shut up and hold still," Evie commanded. She quickly assessed the wound. Matteo's bullet had grazed the lower left rib cage. It hadn't penetrated the abdominal cavity, but it had carved a deep, jagged trench through the muscle, and it was bleeding profusely. "It didn't hit anything vital." "But it's deep," Evie muttered, working with lightning speed. She tore open a packet of lidocaine, loaded a syringe, and injected it around the wound margins. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her. As she worked, cleaning the blood and carefully stapling the jagged edges of the flesh back together, the physical proximity between them became overwhelming. Evie could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She could see the intricate details of the dark angel tattooed across his chest, its wings wrapping around his ribs as if shielding his heart. And she could feel his eyes on her. It wasn't the predatory look of a mob boss. It was a gaze of absolute, unadulterated awe. "Why did you do it?" Dominic asked softly, his voice barely carrying over the rhythmic hum of Leo's ventilator. "Do what?" Evie asked, keeping her eyes focused on the staples. "Matteo had the drop on me. I was calculating the angle, but I was going to take a bullet to put him down. You stepped out from cover. You threw that lamp. You saved my life, Genevieve." Evie stopped wiping the blood. She finally looked up, meeting his pitch-black eyes. "I told you. I don't let people die in front of me if I can help it. I've seen enough death for one lifetime. You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met," Dominic whispered. He reached up, his large, blood-stained hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb stroked the soft skin of her cheek. "I have lived in the dark my entire life. I thought my heart was entirely dead. But tonight, you brought it back to life." Before Evie could process the immense weight of his confession, the intercom on the wall crackled to life. "Boss?" Gideon's voice echoed through the speaker. He sounded exhausted but victorious. "It's over. We neutralized all 12 targets. The penthouse is secure. Matteo is downstairs in the holding cells. He's breathing. Barely." Dominic's expression instantly transformed. The tender, vulnerable man vanished, replaced once again by Il Mietitore. The Reaper had returned. "Good," Dominic said, pressing the intercom button. "Get the cleaners in here. And Gideon, initiate Protocol Omega. Call the captains. Call the lieutenants. Gather every single man we have on the payroll. We are going to war." "Understood, boss. Corelli stands." Dominic pushed himself off the floor, wincing slightly as his freshly stapled ribs pulled, but he stood tall, a towering monument of lethal intent. He walked over to a hidden wall safe behind a medical chart display, entered a code, and pulled out a heavy, black leather duffel bag. He walked back and dropped the bag at Evie's feet. "What is this?" Evie asked, wiping her bloody hands on a towel. "There is $200,000 in untraceable cash in there," Dominic said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of the warmth from a moment ago. There is also a Canadian passport with your photo and a new name, a burner phone, and the keys to a secure car waiting in the sub-basement. A private jet is fueled and waiting at Midway Airport to take you to Geneva. Evie stared at the bag, her mind reeling. You're sending me away. I am going to war, Genevieve, Dominic said, his jaw tight. By tomorrow morning, the streets of Chicago are going to run red. Silas Moretti is going to burn everything to the ground to get to me, and he knows you helped me. You are the only weakness I have. If you stay, you are a target. I promised you protection. This is the only way I can guarantee it. Evie looked at the bag. It was the ultimate out. A fresh start. A life completely free of the trauma, the violence, and the ghosts of Chicago. She could disappear into the pristine mountains of Switzerland and never look back. She looked at the passports. She looked at the money. Then, she looked at the man standing in front of her, the ruthless monster who had just bared his soul to her, the man who had promised to avenge her 6-year-old brother, something the police and the justice system had failed to do for a decade. Evie reached down and zipped the duffel bag shut. She picked it up by the handles and calmly tossed it back to Dominic. He caught it effortlessly, a look of profound confusion crossing his sharp features. Genevieve, you don't understand what is about to happen. I understand perfectly, Evie interrupted, her voice ringing out clear and unshakable in the sterile room. She stepped right up to him, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. I spent the last 10 years running from Silas Moretti's ghosts. I spent 10 years hiding in a hospital, trying to fix the broken pieces his world leaves behind. I am done hiding. Dominic stared at her, utterly speechless. You said you were going to tear his empire down to the studs for what he did to Tommy, Evie said, her hazel eyes burning with a fierce, brilliant fire. Well, if you're going to burn Silas Moretti's world to the ground, Dominic, I want a front row seat. I'm staying. For a long, silent moment, Dominic just looked at her. He saw the fire, the absolute lack of fear, and the unyielding strength that rivaled his own. A slow, dark, and utterly terrifying smile spread across the Mafia boss's face. He dropped the bag to the floor and reached out, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. Then welcome to the family, Genevieve, Dominic whispered, his lips grazing her ear. Let's go paint the city red. And that is how you start a war. Evie rejected the safe way out, proving that she isn't just a survivor. She is a fighter, ready to stand beside the most dangerous man in Chicago to get the justice her brother deserves. From a terrified triage nurse to the fearless queen of the Corelli Syndicate, Evie and Dominic are about to take the city by storm. Will their newfound alliance be enough to crush Silas Moretti's ruthless empire? You'll have to use your imagination for the battles to come. If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance, smash that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves a fiercely independent female lead and a protective, bad boy Mafia boss. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next thrilling audio story. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the money or stayed to fight? See you in the next one.